Hi, this is Mike Morgan for HCI 587. Today I'm going to be talking about online production groups and cybernetics. I'm going to be doing a qualitative meta-analysis. So I'm going to be looking at a case study based on a research paper entitled Beyond Wikipedia, Coordination and Conflict in Online Production Groups. And I'm then going to be comparing it, I'm going to be kind of seeing how it compares to the cybernetics framework to see whether or not it actually sort of fits it. Brief background on the case itself. The case study talks about Wikipedia as being the most popular wiki on the internet, more than 2 million articles in English, although this was published in 2010, so I would imagine that number is significantly larger at this point. The article talks about other wikis that have also been used as well in other fields, classroom, business, science. Wikipedia is actually based on the MediaWiki platform, which really helped popularize the use of online production groups. A great example is the wiki pages that we are currently using for our homework. While much research has been done on Wikipedia in terms of collaborative networks, researchers in this case were actually interested in understanding how generalizable their findings were to wikis used in other contexts. So the goals of this case were really to understand how coordination and conflict evolve and interact within online production groups. So they underwent a content analysis of wiki usage data, looking at more than 6,800 wiki production groups. They, for the most part, utilized regression analysis to kind of compare the effects across coordination mechanisms, conflict. They also looked at number of editors, among some other variables as well. But specifically for coordination, they were actually looking at 4 different mechanisms. These mechanisms included direct communication between users in article talk, as well as user talk pages. So user talk pages are the editorial pages. They're mainly for editors. And the article talk pages were where contributors communicated about their articles. The concentration of work group structure, this is really about the concentration of the number of editors involved in working on articles, as well as policy and procedures. They investigated the growth of conflict, and they've also operationalized conflict as they're doing their analysis. They basically operationalized conflict by using the number of reverts, which is essentially the number of changes, modifications, corrections to content. They also studied the effectiveness of coordination mechanisms on managing conflict as well. So there are a number of key findings from this case. I'm actually just going to highlight a couple of the main ones such that I can get to the cybernetics aspects of this discussion and use these as kind of a backdrop to compare against the theory itself, cybernetics. So some of the key findings were that growth of communication over time between Wikipedia and other wiki communities was similar. Both increased significantly over time, which basically kind of demonstrates that it's not just an anomaly that Wikipedia is growing. It's that the collaboration in the collaborative environment that these wiki communities enables is growing in popularity, so more people are using them. Coordination is a critical task in which wiki production communities invest time and energy, and you'll see shortly that this actually very much ties into cybernetics. It's a core part of it, in fact. But what this suggests is that there may be a set of kind of common rules and guidelines that control coordination. And that another key finding was large differences in usage of policy and procedure related pages, which was one of the coordination mechanisms I mentioned earlier, between Wikipedia and other wikis. So the proportion of edits to namespace pages where policy and procedures are kept was 10%, which was much larger than that of other wiki communities, which is 3%. Lastly, a couple of other key findings. Both Wikipedia and other active wiki communities have a core group of contributors who do much of the work. This suggests that there's almost like a long tail where there's lots of people who aren't necessarily considered core contributors and might be kind of, coming in, maybe doing some contributions, but then for the most part kind of being detached and away from a lot of the activities. And also, the researchers said that a core group of contributors is a critical coordination characteristic for successful wikis. And this is, again, this kind of relates back to the core group of contributors. They also saw that more contributors were associated with more conflicts. Conflicts, as I said earlier, the number of reverts or edits. The beta for this was actually 0.7, which is very high. Something else that I should caveat this with is that the way because they were doing a regression analysis, and they were really looking at, they're not necessarily looking at causality here. They're really looking largely at correlations. And because we're looking at quantitative data, there's a lot of kind of sort of back-end assumptions being made about the why based on the data itself. And this is something clearly is difficult to get by simply looking at just usage data. So what is cybernetics? Cybernetics is really, it's about two things. It's about control and it's about communication. It's the organization of control and communication of complex systems, both man and machine. There's multiple applications. Cybernetics is applied to biology, engineering, communication networks, sociology. There's many, many other examples. So I looked at I kind of created a hierarchy here of the core elements. Both the two sort of supersets of this are communication and control, which really directly relate to the definition of cybernetics. And within communication, you have information, you have the interconnectedness of parts of the system, you have what's called channel capacity, and noise or disturbances. And within control, you have stability, you have feedback, and then you have transitions. And transitions are essentially sort of rules of operation. I took each of these core elements and I established a rubric for kind of assessing the case study within the framework of cybernetics. So do these core elements I just mentioned within control and communication, do they exist within the online production group case study? Are there sort of familiar, relatable analogs within the case study that would fit within this framework? If so, what are they? How do they relate to cybernetics? So what is some more detail around these particular aspects within the case? And how does cybernetics in general just sort of explain some of the key findings I mentioned earlier? So this is the qualitative meta-analysis I did, and you can see here I've listed at the top information, and I've listed the elements underneath. And so within information, really information is the contents that are communicated within complex systems. So this is the stuff within the complex system that is being sort of moved. The analog here within the online production groups in the collaborative environment of wikis is really knowledge. It's knowledge that's used to populate the wiki and knowledge that is shared among contributors within pages. And really, I found for the most part, it was very relevant and more relevant in the context of cybernetics. Communication, how the group organizes itself to relay information. The case study analog here is the online production group is basically a communication network of subject matter experts. These are people that are interacting with each other in order to push information into the wiki, in order to share information and share knowledge. Eventually, ultimately, the goal being, a top quality wiki that people can benefit from. Interconnectedness. So interconnectedness is sort of the parts of a system functioning as a whole. So what's implied in this is that there's sort of a well-defined boundary between the system and its surroundings, and the things within the system are sort of dependent on one another to function. And the sort of the analog here for interconnectedness is that there's sort of a dependency, if you think about a wiki article, for contributors to add their parts of the article in order to complete it. So each contributor is submitting their content and their comments to these pages, the article talk and user talk pages, in order to ultimately produce a quality product. And one contributor, if they're not doing their part, the the goal itself can't be fulfilled. So there's that dependency. Also, noise. Noise is essentially disturbances that kind of require monitoring by a controller, and I'll get into control in a second. Um, but noise is definitely a core element, and the analog here for the case is what they operationalize in the case, which is called conflicts, which is the number of sort of edits, the number of revisions, I should say, within the wiki. And these are conflicts or changes in the wiki made by contributors. And then channel capacity is another one. Um, Channel capacity is really the maximum rate at which information could be transmitted. So information is being transmitted at a certain speed, at a certain volume, and ultimately there's only so much. There's a limited amount of space or capacity with which to push out all of that information. Um, and I was trying to think about what the analog would be in this case, and I struggled a little bit with it. So I would actually say channel capacity is a little less relevant, but that's not to say that information isn't, because information is really important, and information and channel capacity kind of sort of go together. But the best that I can think of is that the channel capacity here is kind of the efficiency of article talk and user talk pages to communicate. How well utilized is are the contributors using these pages to communicate? So I was going to talk about control or regulation, which is really, again, it's sort of the second core aspect of cybernetics. Um, the way I would describe control is it's about monitoring states. It's about sort of sampling your environment to better understand what's going on. Do I need to make a change? Do I need to make a do I need to make a correction? Um, the analog here for monitoring states are really the editors who manage the content within the group. They're sort of the governors, if you will, of the content. Found everything on this page really highly relevant. There's stability, maintaining an equilibrium state, and again, another core concept that relates to control. And really, the analog here was achieving stability through resolving the conflicts. And really that's measured by reverts, the conflicts. How do we make these corrections and establish an equilibrium state? An equilibrium state in this case is the actual completion of the article and its accuracy. Feedback is another core element of cybernetics, and feedback here is about information from the output that's used to inform a decision by the system to act. So I have this information out here. This information I'm gonna sample this information and try to figure out what it's telling me. And so the analog here is really the decision by the editor not to make a correction, which would be considered positive feedback, or to modify, which could not necessarily, but it could be negative feedback. And then another core element are the rules or transitions. And this is the list of possible states based on the inputs provided. And this could be either probabilistic or deterministic. So kind of the guidelines. And in the case here, the analog here in the case study is really the policy and procedures contained within the wiki itself. So these are what drives the behavior of people as they work within the wiki. Another thing I should mention too, though, is that there's probably also, and I think this relates to a probabilistic set of rules, which is the judgment calls made by editors, meaning that just because there's policy and procedures, they could also be using their own judgment to decide, what rules and how to act and how to behave on these wikis. And this again, this introduces a certain level of randomness to the to the rule set. Hence, it's more stochastic. If we take the key findings that I mentioned earlier and we try to kind of put them together with cybernetics and try to understand how these things relate to each other, there's about four things that I can say. One is the coordination aspect, which was a critical task seen as a critical task in wiki communities. It's really central to the cybernetics framework, specifically the core elements under control. And the case study really does a lot of justice to coordination mechanisms. So really, the finding about a core group of contributors doing most of the work within online communities speaks a lot about how coordination and progress is made on these wikis. And then the other finding, the relatively smaller portion of usage of policy-related pages within the smaller wiki communities, I also think this can be supported by cybernetics theories. So according to Wiener, in his book Cybernetics, he says that a small, closely knit communities, they have very considerable measure of homeostasis or stability, and they actually suffer less from the sort of triple constriction of communication. And basically, what he's saying here is that these smaller wiki communities, they're almost more stable because they either might be playing by a different set of rules. In other words, they may not even be following the policies and procedures and just are almost sort of self-governing. And perhaps they're so small that they don't require a lot of changes. So the larger communities, according to Wiener, there's kind of this detachment from events within the communities themselves because of the sort of unequal distribution of power and influence, which happens in these larger communities. And that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the triple constriction of communication in these kind of larger communities. In the case of these smaller wiki communities, they're kind of self-governing and they're more stable in that respect. More contributors being associated with more conflicts is supported by the probabilistic and sort of ever-changing rule set of a complex system. So the rules are always could always change potentially as you're adding more information to the system. In this case, that information is being provided by contributors. You're improving the possibility of disagreement. So sort of your entropy is increasing. There's going to be more disorder in the system, and you're also potentially increasing the variety of perspectives and information entering the system. And there's more and more possible states that you're introducing to the system as well. So because you're introducing more entropy into the system and more possibilities for disagreement, and the rules can be changing as a result of this, this kind of supports the cybernetics ideas around sort of change and stability. Also, another thing that kind of supports this finding is the sort of the new ultra-stable states that might be reached where the system kind of evolves and learns new behaviors. So in the case of a wiki, this might be in the form of more changes to content. So the more contributors being associated with more conflicts, with sort of introducing more randomness into the situation, you can actually reach new different states, and sort of the system itself is almost learning and innovating on itself. And lastly, the concentration of workgroup structures, in this case it's the number of editors, was being positively associated with conflicts. This is also supported by cybernetics. If you think about it intuitively, if you have more people sort of governing the system, more controllers, to help stabilize the noise, the conflicts, this is also going to create its own kind of noise among controllers, given that you're increasing the variety of perspectives potentially in the system. So this idea also is supported by cybernetics as well. So overall, you can see that many of the core elements within the case study are really directly relevant to cybernetics, and that treating collaborative groups as kind of as a social communication network, it's really a highly effective way to understand group behaviors and how they adapt to changes in their complex systems. So thanks for listening to this case study.